Hello and welcome in today's session. For today, we have chosen the topic Forests and Settlements in Ancient India. It's possible to trace through Indian history a changing attitude on the part of the Indians towards their forests. This change is reflected in the texts in Sanskrit, Prakrit, Tamil, and other languages as well as in the oral traditions. There is gradually a self-consciousness and a distancing from the forest, especially in the culture of high literacy. The distancing takes the form of romanticizing the forest at a time when some forests are being cleared and the forest people living there are being forced to change their lifestyle. Often the oral tradition is more sympathetic to the forests. The gradual clearing of forests over the centuries has changed the ecology of certain regions. The pace of change was not uniform. It was slower in earlier times and more limited in its geographical area. But as the demand for land increased, the clearing of the forests became faster and the area so cleared larger. It has been suggested that in the past, there were forest galleries where these animals made a home but have disappeared in the last couple of centuries. These forests and settlements reflected in the various ancient texts are elaborated as perceptions of Tamil literature. Some categories of literature are very aware of ecological differences and their links to culture. Thus, the Tannai concept of Tamil Sangam text composed around the start of the Christian era is a fascinating example of a detailed and early perception of the significance of ecozones. The landscape has been classified into 5 types of ecozones, and these in turn are correlated to other activities and cultural articulation. The zones are listed as the littoral, the wetlands, the pastoral tracts, the dry zone, and the hilly backwoods. Fishing and the making of salt were important to the coastal area, as the cultivation of rice in the wetlands, the breeding of livestock, and the practice of shifting cultivation in the pastoral tracts, which were subject to the cattle lifting from those who lived in the dry zone, and hunting and gathering were associated with these who lived in the backwoods. There was some interaction through the exchange of paddy and salt for other products, generally at places that remained constant and grew to become exchange centers. There have been some historical studies attempting to trace the process by which the micro-ecozones gradually evolved into macrozones. Perceptions of Vedic literature. Early Sanskrit texts such as the Vedas make a distinction between what they call Grama and Aranya. These categories are generally seen as confrontational, but it is a confrontation that is sometimes used to highlight social perceptions. The Grama is the settlement and is therefore orderly, disciplined, known, predictable, and the location of what came to be called civilization. It is the place where Vedic rituals can be performed. It is basic to agriculture, urban living, exchange, government, the arts, and the culture of elite groups. The Aranya is the forest, disorderly, unknown, unpredictable, and inhabited by predators and strange creatures, different from those living in the Grama. This fantasy of associating the unknown with the dark depths of the forest is common to all societies which begin to view the forest from the settlement, as is evident from folk tales and children's stories. Perceptions of 2 epics, Ramayana and Mahabharata. The dichotomy between Grama and Aranya is generic to the narratives of two epics, the Mahabharata and the Ramayana. The forest is the habitat of those who are sent into exile, but gradually the forest comes to be appropriated in the epics, and there is to some degree an identification with the forest. But this identity is kept distinct from that of the settlement, in which the social mores of the grama can be and are transgressed. Among the more graphic descriptions of the deliberate destruction of the forest and forest life are incidents narrated in the Mahabharata. Dushanta goes on a hunt deep into the forest, which brings him to the ashrama where he meets Shakuntala. The hunt is a campaign against nature. He is accompanied by a large band of warriors, and they indiscriminately kill the animals. Herds of deer, families of tigers and elephants are mowed down, and trees are devastated in this process. The people of the settlement are demonstrating their power over nature. Descriptions of the burning of trees and of animals attempting to flee the flames provide a glimpse of the destruction of the forest before establishing a settlement. The grama is again projected as triumphant, irrespective of what may have been involved in the building of the new city. Exiles from grama are different from the people of the forest, because for the former, the forest remains a wild habitat that has to be tamed, whereas for the latter, the forest is the natural habitat. Forest people are said to live on gathering roots and fruit and on hunting wild animals, and this is a different culture from the cultivators and traders who constitute the settled society. The life of the forest people is seen as antithetical to the evolution of civilization, if civilization is defined as the activities of the settled society. The concession to the forest was made in the various ways. The most obvious is the continuing worship of trees. This was the form of either the veneration of the particular trees, such as Ficus religiosa, which has perhaps the longest continuity of a sacred tree in India. It occurs on the sails from the Indus civilization. Perception of Jain and Buddhist literature. Texts associated with Buddhism and Jainism refer to sacred groves, some maintained by the people of St, others by monastery, and still others by the wider community which lived on the edge of the forest. Thus, the Stis of Vaisali, Kushinara, and Champa all maintained sacred groves. The groves may even have been specially planted, as they are often described as being of specific kind of trees, such as the banyan or the sala. Individual trees under worship, sometimes referred to as chaitya, are sacred enclosure, were cordoned off in various ways. Sometimes the individual tree was located amid a sacred grove. The worship of trees as part of fertility cult has remained a constant feature of the religion of pastoralists, peasants, and those of lesser status among urbanites, an undercurrent which from time to time enters the suffuses even the more sophisticated expression of belief and practice. The frequency of sacred groves, some enchanted and magical, and some inhabited by deities, is a common theme in Indian narratives. The tree was and is personified as a deity, and some trees are sacred in their association with the deity. The incorporation of the people of the forest into the society of the settlement required the accommodation of the deities of each to the other in a process of acculturation. Of those that perform their rituals diligently, very few realize that there is much of the forest embedded in their rituals. Pastoral groups form a kind of grey area since they are people who live in the settled society but graze their animals in the forest. They are familiar with only the edge of the forest. But the fact that they have been so important to the Indian culture means that the forest was not seen as altogether hostile or distant. Perceptions of ancient secular literature. The closeness of a man to the forest through asceticism is also demonstrated in the idyllic picture which is often constructed of life in an ashrama in a forest. For example, the setting of the play Shakuntala by Kalidas emphasizes the dichotomy. A forest hermitage is a place of gentleness, peace, and closeness to nature where even the plants and the deer reach out to Shakuntala. This is contrasted with the court in the capital and its hostility and violence. The romanticization of the forest is after it is the habitat of exiles and renouncers and reflects less fear of the forest and more familiarity with it. It could be argued that the romanticization of the forest begins when it is thought that culture is superseding nature. The forest of epic literature is a different kind of forest and has quite another place in the imagination from the forest of Kalidas. The symbolism of Grama and Aranya are marked in early Indian culture, and possibly this enabled the two categories to live coexistentially for many centuries, where the characteristics of one did not impinge on the other. The Arthashastra of Kautilya acknowledges the value of forest wealth by stating that no one is allowed to chop any portion of the forest without the state's consent. This was done to maintain control over the money coming in from both the forest output and the land that had been cleared and put under cultivation. As part of the process of extending agriculture and increasing revenue, Kautilya is also very clear on outlining how the state should clear the wasteland and settle families and farmers on it. Agriculture was extended after 4th century CE, both to bring in greater revenue and perhaps to support a larger population. There appears to have been a greater encroachment on the forests. There are references to violence against forest tribes in a Gupta period inscription and the need to subordinate the dwellers of the forest in inscriptions of a slightly later period, and inscriptions in those days were the official statements. Forest dwellers were brought under control, their forest resource timber, mines, gemstones appropriated, and they were then converted into lower castes of the area and established on the edges of towns or in separate settlements in the forest. This was a process of marginalizing those who lived and worked in the production of the forest. The clearing of wastelands which were substantially jungle and converting them to cultivated land was necessary for the creation of the many small states which emerged at the time, dependent on agriculture for revenue and which continued gradually to increase in number. Shifting cultivation lets the forest reclaim what is cleared. Settlement cultivation means losing the forest altogether, and it was revenue from the settled cultivation that maintained the new states. The expansion of trade and opening up of new areas of commercial exchange also resulted in routes cutting through forests and the conversion of some forest settlements into markets. The establishment of monasteries and ashramas in the forests meant clearing the forest, and unless they were maintained as inaccessible to the rest of the society. In every region of the subcontinent, the forest people have a significant and indisputable influence over the myths that give rise to numerous dynasties. The mythology the most dynasties use to justify their rise to power offer hints as to their lowly and obscure beginnings. However, certain myths from the Brahmanical tradition despise people who live in the jungle. The myth of the first king, Prithu, is one of the most potent. Even to this day, forest people are described as backward and needing to be assimilated into the mainstream of Hindu society. Even benign official policy gets vitiated by such attitudes. Yet it is the people of the forest who are closest to the forest and more in harmony with it than the others. Their knowledge of the forest is different from that of the officials who are supposed to be their benefactors or of that environmentalists who are concerned about the forest and its people. The people living in the forest were in the past subordinated, but as yet the forests were not destroyed. The pressure on the land was less since the pressure on the population was not so great. Today, the problem is that not only are there few forest people left, for most are being brought into the net of modernization, but the forests themselves are being destroyed. Sanskriti gradually gains the status of equivalent to civilization over time. Later, literature in other Indian languages, such as the regional tongues, Turkish and Persian, maintain this dualism. As shown in several Mughal miniatures, the forest is where recluses and holy men escape, and even the princes of the imperial court must travel to meet them. Once more, this is a way of veering clear of the settlement. The ambiguity surrounding using the forest for royal hunts still exists. Interestingly, the action of hunting is a reflection of the contrast between nature and culture. Anyone who relies on hunting for a living is regarded as impolite, despised, and given outcast status. Contempt and interlude of colonial rule. The earliest suspicion of the forest and contempt for the people of the forest was reinforced by colonial rule when forests became an area to be exploited for their wealth, particularly timber, and the people were dismissed as backward and primitive in the vast 19th century sense of the word. Some were seen as wild tribes and some even as criminal tribes, where moral codes were different from those of the colonizers. This somewhat more ameliorating position of romanticizing the forests or treating it as the habitat of the renouncer, which softened the hostility to the forest and was no longer encouraged in colonial attitudes to the forest. The philosophy of colonialism was based on man's necessity to control nature at all costs, even if it meant destroying the forest. A quantitative change came about with the colonial decision to build railway lines. This has been seen as one of the most destructive acts in the clearing of forests. Routes had to be cut through all kinds of terrain, and if there were forests on the way, they were destroyed. The routes were originally located to serve the economic demands of carrying resources to the markets and to the ports, to enhance the growth of industrialization. However, Migration and settlements were encouraged by access to new territories through rail communication. These didn't just take place on the property along rail lines, they frequently led colonists deep into the forested area that had been cleared for farming. Communities were knitted together by railroads, but they were also responsible for many environmental changes. The construction of a vast network of canals in the 19th century had a similar impact because vast areas of the jungle had to be cleared for the canals to pass through the canal colonies to be established. The goal of analyzing these changes critically is not to imply that all technological advancement should be dismissed. Innovations must be investigated more closely to determine the change they will bring in the interaction between man, nature, and culture, now that there is a better understanding of the critical role of environmental conditions. Beyond the environment, attitudes towards other people and mental states are subject to change. Dear students, the colonial era has further distanced us from a potential holistic understanding of nature and culture. In the past, population pressure resulted in the invasion of forest lands, yet there were enough forests to withstand this pressure. The middle class's relentless determination to extract the most profit from the forest is now added to this. There is little hope for the forest and its inhabitants in the strong combination of the politician, the contractor, the bureaucrat, and the industrialist, because they are not allowed to even protest the devastation, much less put an end to it. We are all currently acting as mute witness and spectator to India's forest holocaust. I hope after understanding the content of this lecture, you definitely will contribute your bit in this direction. With this, we come to the conclusion of today's lecture. See you again. Till then, goodbye.